It's 60 CE. You're in a crowded taberna, a few streets off the Forum in Rome. Someone just handed you a wide ceramic cup of wine like it's a gift. It's a hot afternoon. The kind that makes cheap wine taste like vinegar, and good wine taste like a small miracle. This is apparently the good stuff. You take a drink. It's sweet, startlingly sweet, sweeter than wine has any business being without a fortune's worth of honey dumped into it. Somebody nearby grins and tells you it's got sapa in it. Like that explains everything. It does not explain everything. Modern, you would recognize this move instantly. It's the ancient version of finding out your favorite snack has an ingredient list you were never supposed to read. And here's what I need you to sit with before we go any further. That sweetness is not a bonus. It's quietly the most dangerous thing you'll drink all week. And the man who just poured it for you has absolutely no idea why. Here's the part that should bother you. This wasn't some back alley vendor cutting corners to save money. This was the recommended method, written down, taught, repeated for generations. Roman agricultural writers, the guys producing actual instruction manuals for running a farm and a kitchen, told people to make wine this way on purpose, not as a mistake that slipped through once, as advice. And it worked, which is the genuinely uncomfortable part. The wine got sweeter, richer, more prized, more associated with wealth, taste, and status, which means the Romans best positioned to enjoy the most refined version of their own cuisine were, without knowing it, doing the most damage to their own bodies, cup by cup, for years at a time. This isn't a story about one bad batch or one careless cook. It's a story about an entire culture's definition of quality, pointing directly at poison and calling it flavor. So today we're going through all of it. The lead pot bubbling away for hours, the boiled down grape syrup it produced, the honey substitute nobody but the rich could actually afford, the slave stirring the whole mess with no idea what was in the fumes, the aristocrat's joint pain that got blamed on everything except the wine, and the fact that the more dangerous a batch got, the sweeter and more prized it became. There's a strange logic to how humans decide something is good. It says more about taste than about safety. And by the end, you're going to understand why some of Rome's most powerful men may have been quietly poisoning themselves with their own good taste. Let's go. So how do we actually know Romans did this on purpose, generation after generation, instead of one unlucky vineyard poisoning itself by accident because they wrote the recipe down and the recipe survived? Around 60 CE, a Roman writer named Columella published a 12-book farming manual called De Re Rustica. In it, he gives explicit instructions for boiling down grape must into a sweetener called sapa. He specifies the vessel, lead, not bronze, because bronze spoils the flavor. That's not a vague folk memory. That's a named author in a dated text, telling readers which metal poisons wine better. It's not an isolated moment either. About 2 centuries earlier, around 160 BCE, Cato the Elder had already written out essentially the same recipe in the Agri Cultura, the oldest complete Latin farming manual we have. Both books survived for one boring practical reason. Monasteries and scholars kept copying agricultural manuals throughout the Middle Ages because farmers needed working instructions, the same way you'd hang on to a cookbook that actually works. Hold that thought, because it's going to come back at the end, and it's going to hit harder than you expect. Now, here's what you probably assume. You picture ancient poisoning as something dramatic and rare, a scheming relative, a cup meant for one specific target, a scandal with a name attached, something intentional and occasional, not a standing feature of everyday cooking. That assumption makes sense. Poison, in most of what we're taught about the ancient world, is a plot device. Somebody wants somebody else dead, and something toxic shows up in a goblet at exactly the right moment. It's personal. It's rare. It's noticed by someone. Eventually. So the idea that an entire empire's food culture might have been quietly toxic on purpose, taught in manuals and praised for its results, sounds like it has to be an exaggeration, or a modern theory looking for a dramatic headline. It isn't. In 1983, a geochemist named Jerome Nriagu estimated that wealthy Romans could have been ingesting up to 250 micrograms of lead a day from sweetened food and drink alone, largely through sapa. For comparison, public health agencies today treat lead exposure in the single digits as a serious concern in children. 250 micrograms every single day for years is not a rounding error. Nriagu's bigger claim that lead poisoning alone toppled the empire got real pushback from historians. We'll get into exactly where that argument holds up and where it doesn't. But the basic chemistry behind that number was never in dispute. And the recipe that produced it wasn't hidden in the first place. This isn't a reconstructed rumor. It's the actual instructions, published, copied, and followed for centuries. And it's about to get stranger before it gets worse. Let's start with the pot, because everything else here depends on it. To make sapa, you take fresh grape must, unfermented grape juice straight from the press. You pour it into a wide, shallow vessel set over a fire. Columella and Cato both specify the metal, lead, cast into a broad basin sometimes called a cortina, wide enough that the liquid reduces fast and evenly. You don't want bronze or copper for this. Those metals give the boiling must a metallic, bitter edge. Lead does something else entirely. It makes the syrup taste better, smoother, rounder, in a way nobody in the kitchen could have explained at the time. They just knew it worked. They tested it against the alternatives, and they wrote down lead as the correct answer. Why would boiling fruit juice in one specific metal matter this much? Because taste turns out to be one of the most persuasive forces in human decision-making. And Rome trusted it completely. The process itself takes hours, sometimes closer to a full day, over a low, steady fire, with someone stirring constantly so the sugars at the bottom don't scorch. Pliny the Elder, writing his Naturalis Historia around 77 CE, lays out the exact math. Boil the must down by half and you get defrutum. Boil it down to a third of its original volume and you get sapa, thicker, darker, and sweeter still. The kitchen or courtyard where this happens fills with a smell somewhere between grape jam and scorched sugar, thick enough to hang in the air for hours. And here's the detail that should turn your stomach a little. The longer it boils, and the more it's stirred in that lead vessel, the more time the acidic grape juice has to eat into the metal. Acetic acid plus lead does not stay inert. It forms lead acetate, which chemists have literally nicknamed sugar of lead because it tastes sweet. So the recipe wasn't failing to work. It was working exactly as advertised. And the advertisement was the problem. A pot that improves your wine's flavor by very slowly dissolving itself into it is not a design flaw anybody in Rome was equipped to notice. Nothing about the process looked wrong. No burning smell of something rotten, no strange residue. Nothing but a thicker, richer syrup that made cheap wine taste expensive. Would you have noticed either? Most of us trust a product because it tastes right and looks right, not because we've checked what's happening to it at a chemical level. We rarely do. It smells like dinner, not danger, which is honestly the most Roman outcome imaginable. Solve a flavor problem so completely that you accidentally invent a slow-release poison and call it an upgrade. Let's talk about what happens once that syrup actually goes into the cup. The wine cup is only the beginning. This is the part that makes the whole picture so much bigger than one bad drink. Sapa and defrutum weren't reserved for special occasion wine. They went into sauces, into preserved fruit, into the reduction poured over roasted meat, into pretty much anything a Roman cook wanted to sweeten or thicken without paying for imported honey. Apicius, the surviving Roman cookbook compiled from recipes across several centuries and pulled together around the 4th century CE, includes roughly 90 separate recipes, out of about 450 total, that call for a lead-derived sweetener somewhere in the ingredients. That's one recipe in 5. Not a rare luxury ingredient reserved for the wealthiest table in Rome once a year. A standard pantry item, sitting next to the olive oil and the fish sauce used constantly, in ordinary kitchens. We're not talking about a niche technique some fringe cook picked up. We're talking about a fifth of an entire cookbook. And here's where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, because exposure to sapa tracked wealth almost perfectly. The poorest Romans drank thin, watered-down wine and ate whatever was cheapest, which meant less sapa, less defrutum, less lead. The wealthy could afford wine that was richer, sweeter, more heavily reduced, served more often, at longer dinners, in larger cups, refilled more times in a single evening. Which means the empire's elite, the senators, the generals, the men writing the laws and commanding the legions, were systematically consuming more of the exact substance that was quietly damaging their joints, their kidneys, and their nervous systems. There's a medical condition called Saturnine gout. Gout caused specifically by chronic lead exposure rather than diet alone. Roman writers describe gout among the aristocracy so often it practically reads as an occupational hazard of being rich. They just never connected it to the cup in their own hand. Why would they? Nothing about a joint ache in your 50s points backward to a dinner party decades earlier. This isn't only coming from ancient authors describing symptoms secondhand. In 2021, a research team led by Delisle published a study in the journal Environmental Science and Technology. They analyzed lead levels preserved in the petrous bone, a dense skull bone that locks in chemical traces for thousands of years, from 132 individuals found near Rome and on the island of Sardinia. They found the ratio of lead to calcium in those bones spiked roughly 4,000 times higher during the height of the Roman Imperial period compared to the pre-industrial baseline. 4,000 times. Not 4 times, not 40. That's an entire population walking around with a chemical signature in their skeletons that basically screams industrial-era contamination, centuries before anything resembling an industrial era existed. We're talking about a bone, buried for 2,000 years, that still remembers exactly how much lead once passed through the body it belonged to. That's not a theory. That's chemistry, sitting quietly in a storage drawer, waiting for someone to ask the right question. And here's the sentence I need you to actually sit with. The empire's most celebrated food culture, the wine that impressed guests, the sauces that made Roman cooking famous enough that we still have the cookbook, was built around a substance we've spent the last century trying to remove from paint, pipes, and gasoline because it damages the developing brain at almost any measurable dose. Sit with that comparison for a second because it isn't just a dramatic line. We banned leaded gasoline. We banned lead paint. We spent enormous public money ripping lead pipes out of the ground, street by street, city by city, once the science on childhood exposure became impossible to argue with. And here's an entire empire that ran that exact experiment in reverse on purpose for centuries. Because somebody in the 1st century, tasting a spoonful of syrup off the back of a wooden spoon, decided lead was the missing ingredient. Rome didn't stumble into lead exposure by accident. It optimized for it on purpose, because lead-sweetened food tasted better, and taste was the only test anybody had. Nobody had a lab. Nobody needed one. The tongue was the instrument, and the tongue said yes every single time. Here's the part of this story that gets uncomfortable fast, and it's the part most retellings skip entirely. Somebody had to stand over that lead pot for hours, stirring. Columella's De Re Rustica isn't a lifestyle guide. It's an estate management manual, written for landowners running large farms, worked almost entirely by enslaved labor. The sapa-making instructions sit in the same books as chapters on disciplining slaves and rationing food for a work gang. The person doing the actual stirring, hour after hour, batch after batch, season after season, wasn't the senator drinking the finished wine at dinner. It was someone with no name in the record, standing over a boiling lead vessel because that was the job they had been assigned. With no idea that the fumes rising off that syrup were the same poison quietly building up in their own blood. Did anyone ever ask that person how they felt after a long day at the pot? There's no record of it. Nobody thought the question was worth writing down. Think about the math for a second, because it matters. Nriagu's estimate of roughly 250 micrograms of lead a day was for someone simply eating and drinking normally in a wealthy Roman household. The person actually producing the sapa was inhaling concentrated fumes off a boiling lead vessel for hours at a stretch, with hot syrup splashing on hands and forearms, day after day, for as long as they held that job. There was no ventilation, no rotation schedule, no protective anything. Nobody in the first century had a reason to think the pot itself was the danger. If the aristocrat drinking 1 cup a night absorbed a slow, steady dose, isteinabat zor jain kapins, the enslaved worker stirring the pot that made it was almost certainly absorbing a far larger one, for far longer. Getting none of the credit for the flavor everyone praised at dinner. We know roughly how bad prolonged, industrial-level lead exposure gets from modern occupational studies. We can only assume it was worse here, with none of the safeguards we'd now consider a bare minimum. And this is where modern people get squeamish. And Romans simply didn't. The entire economy of Roman food production ran on assigning the most physically dangerous, repetitive tasks to people who had no say in the matter and no way to opt out. Would you take that job if someone explained the real risk to you honestly? Almost certainly not. But that's the whole point. Nobody explained anything, because nobody on either side of the pot understood what the pot was actually doing. Nobody scratched a complaint about lead fumes into a wall. Not because nobody suffered, because the people suffering weren't the ones who got to write the record. Which brings us to a name that did survive. Someone whose actual life we can trace through this exact world of Roman wine, status, and the things people did to their bodies without knowing it. Let's put a real face on this, because one exists. The man behind the most detailed lead vessel instructions we have was named Lucius Junius Moderatus Columella, born around 4 CE, probably in the city of Gades on the Spanish coast, modern Cadiz. He served for a while as a military tribune. Then he retired from that life entirely and did something almost nobody with his background bothered to write about in detail. He ran farms. Real ones. In the hills outside Rome. In Ardea. Near Alba and Caere. Testing methods on his own land before recommending them to anyone else. De Re Rustica, the 12-book manual he wrote late in life, reads less like philosophy and more like a foreman's notebook. Specific measurements, specific timings, specific materials. Because he had personally overseen the harvest, the pressing, and almost certainly the boiling pot itself more than once. When Columella tells you lead is the correct metal for the job, he isn't repeating a rumor. He's reporting from his own kitchen, on his own land, based on results he watched happen with his own eyes. We know this much about him because he wanted us to. His own words are still the primary source scholars go back to. What we don't know, and I want to be upfront about this, is how Columella himself died, or whether decades of tasting his own sapa played any role in it. The record simply doesn't say. What we can say with more confidence is what the person actually stirring his pot looked like, because Columella describes the labor structure of his own estates elsewhere in the same books. An enslaved workforce, organized under an overseer, assigned specific jobs by season. Somewhere on one of those farms, in the years he was drafting his instructions, there was a real person standing over a lead basin in the heat. Sweat running down bare forearms, already flecked with dried syrup. Breathing in fumes for hours at a stretch, season after season, with no name that survived into any book. Do we know anything else about them? No. Not their name, not their age, not whether they had a family waiting at the end of the day, not because their work mattered less, because nobody who could write ever thought to ask their name. You're holding the same cup that person filled. They never got to hold it themselves. So here's where I have to be honest with you, because this channel does not fake certainty. We have to be careful here, because it's tempting to fill in gaps with confidence just because the story already feels complete. Nobody in the 1st century diagnosed lead poisoning. There was no blood test, no direct link anyone drew between a sweet cup of wine and an aching joint decades later. Everything here, the recipe, the chemistry, the bone data, the gout, is a reconstruction built from separate pieces that happen to fit together with unusual precision. And the boldest version of this theory, that lead poisoning alone brought down the Roman Empire, is not something serious historians accept. That claim stretches a real pattern further than the evidence can carry, and it's been challenged hard, and fairly, since the 1980s. Where the evidence gets solid again is narrower and honestly more interesting. Individual, chronic, elective poisoning, cup, by people who genuinely thought they were choosing quality. That narrower claim holds up well. The recipe is real, written down twice, centuries apart, by 2 named authors. The chemistry isn't in dispute. Acidic liquid plus lead produces lead acetate. Reliably, every time. The bone record carries a signature that lines up with the written instructions almost exactly. So how much more proof would you actually need? None of that requires speculating about collapse or civilizational decline. It just requires admitting that an entire culture optimized its food for a taste it couldn't explain, using a method it never once suspected. That's not a story about an empire falling. That's a story about a kitchen, repeated for centuries. 1 cup, 1 batch, 1 unnamed hand at a time. Go back to that taberna. 60 CE, the wide ceramic cup still warm in your hand. That impossible sweetness sitting on your tongue like it's a compliment to whoever poured it. Remember the recipe I told you to hold on to, the one written down by Columella and, 2 centuries earlier, by Cato. Kept alive for the most unglamorous reason imaginable. Monasteries needed working farm manuals, so scribes kept recopying them, book after book, century after century, purely because the instructions were useful. That's the only reason you can read the exact recipe for what's in your cup right now, 17 centuries after Rome fell. Not because anyone wanted to warn you, because nobody ever stopped finding the recipe genuinely, dangerously good. We didn't inherit a warning. We inherited a compliment, copied out by hand for 1,000 years because it was too useful to let go of. And here's the bridge to right now. Somewhere in your kitchen is a sweetener you've never questioned. A can, a packet, a bottle, something that makes food taste better through a process you've never once looked up, made by a method you're simply trusting because everyone around you trusts it too. Rome trusted the pot. We trust the packet. Nobody's checking the fine print. We like to think we're smarter than that, more informed, less gullible than a Roman with a lead pot and a good recipe. Maybe we are, but has the pattern actually changed? Or does something just have to taste good enough, with everyone else already doing it, for the questions to stop mattering? So, question for you. If the thing making your food taste better right now turned out to be quietly working against you decades from now, would you actually want to know? Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you soon.